Today we're heading to San Antonio, Texas, a city near the Mexican border that stands out for its incredible cultural diversity and tradition blending. This border location plays a crucial role, offering a slice of home for Mexicans. The name San Antonio itself, derived from Mexico's national language, Spanish translates to Saint Anthony, which is quite fitting for the city. A highlight of San Antonio is the Trinity University College of Arts and Sciences, particularly the Murchison Tower. Standing at 166 feet, it was once the tallest structure in the city. One day, a young man walked into the university campus. He made his way to a women's dormitory on the second floor, found a specific room, and forcibly entered by breaking the door handle, wreaking havoc inside. With furious anger, he scattered clothes around the room, broke furniture, and tore apart books and notebooks on the desk. His rage was uncontrollable, and by the time security arrived due to the noise, he was sitting on the bed crying, a spilled soda in his hand. The young man was arrested and taken to the police station. The damage inflicted on the room and the university was assessed at $1,650. The individual apprehended was 22-year-old Mark Howerton. Recently, he had lost his beloved girlfriend Cayley and was struggling to cope with his loss. He went to her room and couldn't manage his emotions. During his arrest, he cried incessantly, repeatedly calling out Cayley's name. 4 months prior to this incident, Mark Howerton was charged in connection with the demise of his girlfriend and Trinity University cheerleader, Cayley Mandadi. This story is riddled with rumors, questions, and an abundance of information from law enforcement agencies. But let's take it from the top. Cayley Anita Mandadi was born on August 26, 1998, in Webster, to Tilak Mandadi and Allison Steele. The family was well off. Allison was a scientist, and Tilak worked as an international executive director at MGM Resorts. After her parents divorced, Allison remarried NASA engineer Lawrence Butlin, who lived in Houston, when Cayley was 9. Despite her parents' separation, Cayley maintained a strong relationship with her father, regularly communicating with him. Her stepfather also adored Cayley and became a second dad to her. Cayley was not just a grateful and loving daughter and granddaughter, but also an excellent student, team member, sister, and friend whose infectious laughter and kind heart could light up any rules. In school, Cayley excelled academically and participated in all extracurricular activities. She enjoyed horseback riding, played the piano, and even performed in theater. Cayley was a Girl Scout, ran around the Clear Lake neighborhood with her friends, and went on hikes with her parents. In 2016, she graduated with honors from Clear Creek High School in League City, Texas. Cayley loved animals and joyfully participated in a volunteer group called Animal Therapy. She was always eager to explore new and uncharted territories, dreamed of trying extreme sports, and was constantly in search of thrilling experiences. At 19, the slender, dark-haired Cayley was already a sophomore at Trinity University in San Antonio, where she was studying communications. She was well-liked with many friends and led the football team's cheerleading squad. Her vibrant and radiant beauty attracted many admirers. One day during a football game where she was cheering for the Trinity team, she met 22-year-old Mark Howerton. The tall, bright athlete and professional baseball player failed to catch Cayley's eye at first, since she was smitten with Jet and paid no attention to anyone else. But Mark fell for her at first sight, captivated by her large black eyes and the charisma that set her apart from the rest of the cheer squad. Their first meeting didn't go well, nor did their second. However, Mark persisted, and by September 2017, they officially started dating. From the beginning, their friends and acquaintances deemed them an ill-matched pair, as both were too emotional and quick-tempered. Their relationship lacked compromise, marked from the start by tumultuous arguments and confrontations. The young, passionate couple was constantly jealous and quarreled often. Friends who observed their relationship reported that Cayley frequently had bruises on her arms and legs. A close friend also shared about an incident that deeply frightened her. Cayley once asked her to retrieve her mobile phone from Mark because she was too scared to do it herself. The situation escalated to the point where Mark became aggressive, brandishing a gun and threatening violence. Cayley was aware of her boyfriend's jealousy and temper, but always reassured her friends and asked them not to publicize their loud arguments, since she admitted she wasn't entirely innocent either. However, around 1 a.m. on September 24, 2017, Cayley's roommates couldn't stand it anymore and called the police. They heard loud noises coming from Cayley's room and a man yelling and threatening violence. The responding officer found Mark alone in the room. Cayley declined to press charges, stating nothing had happened and it was just a lover's quarrel. But her friends believed Mark was using controlled substances, leading to uncontrollable outbursts of anger. He once threatened to throw Cayley off a balcony. Her friends reported this to the police as well. Their relationship was like an ocean. During a storm, the waves were tumultuous, but in calm weather, they were blissfully in love. On October 29th, Mark and Cayley went to the Malaluna Music Festival in San Antonio. It's one of the largest music festivals focusing on gothic, modern industrial, and dark wave music, attracting over 10,000 people annually. Malaluna is a hotspot for partygoers and those seeking solitude, as it's easy to blend into the crowd and disappear within its bounds. Mark and Cayley had a great time partying with their friends throughout the evening. However, the unexpected arrival of Cayley's ex once again drove Mark to the edge. They had a major argument and left the festival early. That was the last time their friends saw them that night. 6 hours later, deep into the night, Mark's black Mercedes pulled up at a hospital. He rushed out of the car, desperately waving and calling for help. The medical staff found a semi-nude girl in the front seat, unconscious. The car was in disarray, Cayley's clothes were scattered about, and she sat slumped forward like a lifeless doll. Cayley was moved onto a stretcher and taken to the emergency room. Mark informed the hospital staff that they had consumed illegal substances prior to attending the festival. This information aided doctors in treating her for a potential overdose. She was then transferred to another medical facility in Kyle, Texas, where a nurse specialized in intimate assault cases examined her and discovered additional bruises on her arms, legs, and ear. A forensic examination determined that blunt force trauma to the face and head was the cause of demise, indicating Cayley had been the victim of a fatal assault. Consequently, police initiated an investigation to find the individual responsible for Cayley Mandadi's loss of life. Mark was the primary suspect since he was the last person seen with Cayley that night, yet there were no concrete pieces of evidence linking him to the crime. However, Mark cast suspicion on himself. With each subsequent police interview, he altered his account of events, drawing investigators' attention. Surveillance footage captured him and Cayley in locations Mark had failed to mention. Furthermore, conversations with Cayley's friends and family members revealed his tendency towards aggressive behavior towards her. One of her sisters even expressed being terrified of him. The police uncovered alleged incidents of violence between the couple, including Mark hitting Cayley's head against a car window and trashing her dorm room at Trinity. Upon learning about Mark's previous assaults on Cayley at the university, her parents were devastated. The mother of the slain Trinity University cheerleader, Cayley Mandadi, filed a lawsuit against the institution, alleging it failed to take necessary steps to protect her daughter from her boyfriend's attacks, who is accused of causing her demise in a fit of jealousy. The lawsuit was filed in the Bexar County District Court on behalf of the mother, Allison Steele. The former boyfriend of her daughter, Mark Howerton, is also named as a defendant. The suit claims that Howerton assaulted the 19-year-old from League City and was ultimately responsible for her fatality. According to the lawsuit, Trinity staff, its administration, and campus police were aware of Mark Howerton's erratic behavior during their relationship. It alleges that the man threatened to break Cayley Mandadi's face or inflict serious bodily harm. But the university took no action in the weeks leading up to her demise to protect the young woman. A spokesperson for Trinity University declined to comment on the lawsuit's allegations, citing the ongoing legal process. Trinity University's failure to respond to numerous reports of harassment, cruel treatment, intimidation, domestic violence, and gender discrimination led to the tragic end of the sophomore. Alison Steele's statement also mentioned that Cayley Mandadi's tragedy could have been prevented had Trinity intervened as it should have. The university ignored its own policy on investigating and responding to potential cases of violence and harassment in relationships, as stated in the lawsuit. After an incident in the dorm room, Mark was issued a criminal trespass order, banning him from the campus for a year, yet he repeatedly violated it. Additionally, detectives discovered many stories of Mark's violent behavior towards Cayley during their relationship. For instance, one of her sisters recounted that he threatened to throw her off a balcony during an argument, while another claimed he also threatened to shoot some of her ex-boyfriend's brothers with his gun. Based on all these statements against him, the police were able to issue a warrant for his arrest, after which he turned himself in. In February 2018, following the discovery of Cayley's room in disarray at the university, Mark Howerton surrendered to the police. He faced multiple charges including criminal acts, intimate violence, and abduction. However, he pleaded not guilty to these charges. The first trial regarding Cayley Mandadi's demise began in December 2019. Prosecutors argued that Mark, known for his volatile temperament, fatally assaulted Cayley Mandadi in a fit of rage. They also claimed that he transported her for nearly 6 hours before taking her to the hospital. In defense, Mark's legal team contended that Cayley's end could be attributed to various factors. Autopsy reports revealed the presence of banned substances in her system, suggesting a potential spike in blood pressure or head trauma during intimate activity. Cayley's mother recounted that the injuries and bruises on her daughter's body were severe, akin to falling from an airplane. Indeed, the injuries were extensive. Photos presented to the jurors of Bexar County showed the Trinity University sophomore from San Antonio, Texas, barely recognizable with bruises from head to toe, red marks and scratches. Both of her eyelids were swollen and bruised. The only areas without any sign of injury were her back and the back of her legs. Graphics and photographs taken by Dr. Susanna Dana, the forensic pathologist who conducted Cayley Mandadi's autopsy, showed a subdural hematoma, a collection of blood usually associated with traumatic brain injury on the right side of her brain. Cayley's father, Tilak Mandadi, after seeing 2 photos where the victim was in the ICU in a vegetative state, surrounded by numerous tubes with her face hardly visible, spoke about his daughter with a trembling voice as tears filled his eyes. "That's my daughter," he said, "my only child." Dr. Susanna Dana stated that upon examining Mandadi's head, she found a dent in her skull. Most of the doctor's testimonies focused on the cranial and facial injuries Mandadi suffered, which Dana described as severe injuries. These injuries included eye trauma. Both eyelids were bruised, with the left eyelid so swollen it couldn't fully close. There were extensive bruises on both the left and right jaws, bruises on the inside of the mouth, above the teeth on the gums, on the lips and cheeks. There were hemorrhages in both eyes, she said, showing photos of the inner eyelid lining. She concluded that the cause of Mandadi's demise was a blunt object's head and facial trauma. Dr. William Anderson reviewed the autopsy results and disagreed with the conclusions that Cayley Mandadi had been attacked. "We don't see any fractures in the orbit. No fractures in the nose either. We don't see any fractures on the face. This indicates that there was no frontal assault. Instead, Anderson suggested that the young woman's injuries were more consistent with a fall and extensive medical intervention." Defense attorney John Hunter presented an alternative narrative, stating that the prosecution lacked sufficient evidence to clarify what happened to Cayley Mandadi that night. Proving Mark Howerton's involvement in the incident was deemed impossible. Throughout the trial, he frequently pointed to Cayley Mandadi's drug use, at one point referencing her treatment for substance dependence at a hospital. Jason Wallach, a professor at the University of Sciences in Philadelphia, testified that Cayley Mandadi had a high level of MDMA, commonly known as ecstasy or Molly, in her blood after her boyfriend took her to the hospital on the evening of October 29, 2017. The presence of these substances indicated that a person could sustain a minor head injury, and the effects of MDMA could turn it fatal. John Hunter, building on the above conclusions, suggested that the drug affects each person differently. Many people experience an increase in body temperature or an electrolyte imbalance when taking the substance. According to him, these conditions could lead to a loss of consciousness. The jury began to hear testimonies. That day, jurors saw a video and heard an audio recording from police officers, where Mark Howerton told investigators that he and Cayley had an argument and engaged in intimate relations in the car before she passed out, and that they enjoyed engaging in rough intimacy. He stated he would strangle her during the act because she liked it. Mark Howerton claimed that everything was consensual, but where did these bruises come from and when? This question remained unresolved during the trial concerning Cayley's demise in December 2019. Allison firmly believed that Mark Howerton would be held responsible for her daughter's end. However, after the 2019 trial, the family felt deeply disappointed. Although Mark was charged with ending a life, he maintained his innocence. The defense argued that the victim's injuries were inflicted during resuscitation efforts by hospital staff. As a result, the jury could not reach a verdict, leading to a mistrial. The case was heard in the 144th District Court of the state, presided over by Judge Raymond Angelini. When the jury could not reach a verdict, the case was declared a mistrial and dismissed. Thus, in the first trial, Howerton was acquitted of the charges, leaving the case unresolved. Bexar County District Attorney Joe Gonzalez, who had been handling the case from the beginning, expressed his disappointment with the outcome and stated that he would review the case. During this time, Cayley Mandadi's parents decided to start their investigation. They collected all evidence and autopsy reports from the police and focused on a small, round, pinpoint bruise near Cayley's ear. Allison and Lawrence speculated that Mark might have hit her head against the car window, causing her to hit the door lock and get bruised. They hoped this would establish his guilt. Identifying a similar Mercedes, the car Mark was driving that night, Lawrence took photos, posing in a manner they believed reflected the circumstances under which Cayley might have injured her head. With the assistance of Texas Rangers, they obtained records, 3 written affidavits under oath, in the warrant for Howerton's arrest on charges of criminal acts, aggravated intimate assault and criminal mischief, addressing many questions about Mandadi's case and providing a detailed timeline of events before and after her demise. The slideshow listed key moments in chronological order leading to Cayley's death and the evidence found during the investigation. Specifically, the timeline provided by authorities sheds light on Mark Howerton's alleged falsehoods to the Rangers and the evidence that led to his arrest. Throughout the trial, prosecutors portrayed Howerton as a manipulative and controlling boyfriend who constantly called Cayley and took her phone away so she couldn't talk to friends. At one point, 2 weeks before her demise, Howerton pushed Mandadi against a brick wall and in a fit of rage trashed her dorm room. Soon after, Cayley told Mark that she needed space, according to texts reviewed by the jury. Howerton began sending her dozens of messages, at one point threatening to end his life. She pleaded with him not to do so. In total, he called her about 200 times that evening. Then, they attended a festival and argued over Cayley's ex-boyfriend, who was also there. Mark Howerton took Cayley Mandadi from the festival, placed her in the car, and drove to a deserted parking lot near the Whataburger headquarters, close to US 281 and Sunset Road. GPS camera records show that the couple was in the parking lot for over an hour. Prosecutors suggested that it was there Mark Howerton attacked Cayley Mandadi and beat her to death. Cayley Mandadi's family thanked the Texas Rangers for their diligent work in bringing the appropriate criminal charges against Cayley's alleged assailant. The retrial for Mark Howerton commenced in June 2023 after delays due to the COVID-19 pandemic. At the trial, the prosecution considered presenting a video recorded by Cayley Mandadi's parents, capturing her injuries in the hospital, but ultimately withdrew it due to potential complications and new disputes. Evidence collected with the help of Texas Rangers was also taken into account. Mark Howerton was found guilty of aggravated assault causing bodily harm, leading to legal case. The court sentenced him to 20 years in prison, with a $10,000 fine and restitution to Cayley Mandadi's family. Additionally, he was barred from contacting over 20 individuals involved in the case. Mark, now over 30 years old, is serving his sentence in the Willacy County Jail, eligible for parole in 2033. The conviction brought some closure to Cayley's family, though they stated the sentence seemed insufficient for their loss. In the second trial, Mark Howerton faced charges including aggravated assault, causing serious bodily harm, in addition to the initial charge of manslaughter from the first trial. Unlike the first trial, the prosecution expanded the charges to include aggravated assault and criminally negligent homicide. The legal strategy was adjusted to present a more comprehensive case against Mark Howerton. However, dissatisfied with the outcome, Cayley's family and prosecutors insisted on a retrial. Cayley Mandadi's tragic story highlighted the devastating impact of violence on a young life and her grieving family's quest for justice. This complex case is the focus of the article The Final Hours of Cayley Mandadi, reported by 48 Hours correspondent Peter Van Sant. Cayley Mandadi's story serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of violence against young people with promising futures. Despite the conviction, Cayley's family stated that the verdict does not serve justice for their beloved daughter. In 2019, Allison Steele, Cayley Mandadi's mother, successfully lobbied the Texas legislature to expand the missing persons alert system in Texas. She then founded the nonprofit organization Cayley's Calling, aiming to consolidate missing persons alert systems. Steele also established a nonprofit dedicated to providing public information about the Clear Alert, an emergency broadcasting alert in Texas for individuals aged 18 to 64. In addition to these efforts, in 2021, she filed a civil lawsuit against Trinity University alleging negligence in protecting her daughter. Steele claimed that none of Cayley's guardians were informed that Mark Howerton had trashed her dorm room. She also stated that the university took no action against him, allegedly giving him continuous access to her daughter and making her vulnerable to manipulation. It remains unclear whether the evidence collected by Allison and Lawrence was presented at Mark Howerton's trial in 2023. Despite being acquitted of the charge of ending a life, he was found guilty of aggravated assault causing bodily harm. Prosecutors noted that the family expressed satisfaction with the verdict, as they had endured prolonged suffering and felt relief that the legal proceedings had concluded, allowing them to begin the healing process. Losing a child is an agonizing ordeal, and sadly, it was a heart-wrenching journey that Cayley Mandadi's parents had to endure. Allison Steele said they are still completely devastated by the loss of Cayley and ask those of faith to pray for her family, friends, and for justice in this matter. Twins Daniel and David have always made all the important decisions together since they were kids. They both chose to work as mechanics, cheered for the same sports team, and often finished each other's sentences. No one could have guessed that one day the brothers would plan an almost perfect crime together. After all, even if the police had managed to find traces of DNA, the prosecutor would not have been able to convince a jury of Dan or David's guilt. Standard forensic DNA analysis, as of today, cannot distinguish between identical twins because they have virtually identical genetic profiles, and a jury will always have room for reasonable doubt. It took law enforcement officials 10 years to catch the brothers. It was only because David decided to make a deal with the prosecutor and testified against Daniel that the police were able to solve the case that will be discussed today. On July 22, 2003, the car of her husband, with whom the 30-year-old woman was in the process of divorce, drove up to the house of Heather's parents. The final divorce hearing was only a week away. The man got out of the car with a huge bouquet of flowers and a card with a touching picture, heading toward the house, hoping that he would still be able to reconcile and avoid divorce. The reason to keep the marriage alive was not because of his great love for his spouse or his desire to keep the family cozy. Daniel realized the court decision to pay alimony will not leave money for his usual life. Perhaps he even lost the house. The man was desperately looking for a way out and expected to solve the problem with a bouquet of flowers and promises. The plan failed. Heather firmly rejected Daniel's proposal. The conversation turned violent, and Heather's father, Dave Springer, even had to intervene. Only after Dave promised to call the police did Daniel angrily yell that Heather was ruining his life and leave the house. Springer, a former member of the Denver Police Department, realized by some special instinct that his son-in-law was dangerous to his daughter. He asked her not to see him for the rest of the divorce proceedings. He would later say, "I was worried about what my son-in-law Dan DeWild might do as the final divorce approached." He wanted to keep things under his control, but control was slipping away from him, and he was becoming more and more desperate, more and more hostile. I told Heather not to date him, and I didn't think she would, but she did. 2 days later, Dan called Heather and offered to pick up the children's medical records and a signed child support check. Initially, the now almost ex-spouses agreed to meet at McDonald's. The young woman did not want to be alone with her ex-husband and planned to meet in a crowded place, taking her 2 children, who were 5 and 3 years old at the time. She didn't say anything to the father, alerting only the mother to the meeting. Obviously, something went wrong. The plan changed, or she originally named the nearest fast food restaurant as the meeting place to appease her mother. But Heather went not to McDonald's, but to Daniel's home in Edgewater, Colorado, where he lived at the time with his identical twin brother David and David's then-girlfriend Roseanne. Heather felt that in the presence of the children, Jacob and Hannah, their father would not be aggressive, and he was not alone at home. And then the young woman disappeared. She was never seen alive again. Heather Springer was born on April 21, 1973 in Arvada, Colorado. The head of the household, David Springer, who worked for the Denver Police Department, was respected by his colleagues and was highly regarded as a professional in his field. The man did everything possible to make sure that his beloved wife, Carol, Heather, and her 2 older sisters, Rebecca and Jennifer, nothing needed. The family had a friendly, warm atmosphere of mutual understanding. For her sisters, their father was a model of masculinity, responsibility, and care. In her youth, Heather tried to build relationships with her peers, but nothing much came out. When she met Dan DeWild, who was 10 years older than her, she saw in him an adult, responsible, caring man, and felt as calm and safe as with her father. Daniel, being a mature man, was winning in Heather's eyes compared to his peers. The 23-year-old young woman fell in love without looking back. The couple began dating in 1996, and a year later, Dan made an offer, which Heather gladly accepted. She grew up in a family where her father, due to his professional activities, always showed control, and the same quality in the groom she automatically considered a manifestation of love and protection. Unfortunately, she was mistaken. The young couple moved to the town of Edgewater, Colorado, where Dan owned a home. 2 children were born to the DeWild family, Hannah and Jacob. Heather devoted herself completely to her daughter and son, doing the household chores. Dan, as the main breadwinner of the family, worked as a mechanic in the transportation department. However, in family life was not all cloudless. Gradually, the young woman realized that Dan's excessive control is not a manifestation of care and love. Over time, he only became more overwhelming and restrictive. Dreams of a happy union did not materialize. After 5 years of marriage in 2002, Heather began to complain to her parents about her husband. She said that she was tired of Dan's constant control. It was simply unbearable to live with him in the same house. A year later, in the spring of 2003, the young woman informed Dan that she wanted a divorce. She packed her things and moved with her children to her parents' house in Arvada. Dan reacted very negatively to her still legal spouse's actions and even threatened her, which only strengthened her decision to protect her interests and those of her children. She filed for divorce, sought custody of the children, and had her husband pay child support. The situation became stressful for Daniel because he was not prepared for the additional considerable financial obligations. He was afraid that he would not be able to pay the bills and would likely lose his home. In early summer, his brother David came to Dan's aid along with his roommate Roseanne to provide support and help with the difficult situation. Dan and David DeWild, identical twins with only 1.5 minutes difference in age, have been inseparable all their lives, helping each other, constantly keeping in touch. Friends of the twins noted that Dan always acted as a leader, making key decisions, while David preferred to stay in the shadow of his brother and occupy secondary positions. After arriving, David started working as a mechanic at the same place where Dan worked and gave a significant amount of money to his brother to pay the house bills. It was David who suggested that Dan try to prevent a final divorce and supported his idea of going to see Heather on July 22, 2003. The trip, as is already known, ended in failure and almost calling the police. The brothers then devised a new plan, inviting Heather to their home on July 24th. The distance from Heather's parents' house and to the nearest McDonald's was only a few kilometers. The daughter, who had only gone to pick up her papers, should have returned long ago. When an hour passed, Heather's mom, Carol Springer, became concerned. Her daughter wasn't picking up her cell phone, and Carol called her son-in-law to find out where Heather was. Dan reported that she had arrived at his house, left the kids, and drove off in her car to the store. All of this seemed alarming to Carol, since she knew her daughter's wallet and credit cards were left at home. She couldn't go shopping without the money and cards, and she certainly would never leave her grandchildren with Dan. Freezing with a bad feeling, an agitated Carol dialed Dave's number and told him who their daughter had gone to see and when. Dave Springer immediately went to his former son-in-law's house. Heather wasn't there, and her car was nowhere to be found either. Dan still maintained that Heather had gone away on her own business, leaving the children with him, and should be back soon. The grandchildren couldn't tell their grandparents where their mom was or where she had gone. Dave called the emergency services. With his experience as a police officer, he sensed that his daughter was in trouble. Soon, patrol officers arrived at Dan DeWild's house. The officers inspected the area near the house and the house itself, which Dan allowed to enter, but found nothing suspicious outside or inside, then left. The only thing the officers were able to find out was that the medical records Heather had come for were at Dan's house, and the child support check was still unsigned. Dave Springer got behind the wheel of his auto and began driving the city streets, hoping to find his daughter alive. Passing intersections, he stopped his gaze on passers-by, looked at the faces of women, interviewed local residents, but the search was fruitless. The next morning, July 25th, Heather DeWild was officially reported missing. Detective Mark Kreider of the Denver Police Department joined the search for the woman. The detective took Dave's suspicions seriously. No one believed that Heather simply decided to run away on vacation from her family. Already after the trial, Kreider told reporters, "Dave was obviously extremely concerned. The case was unusual because the daughter of a Denver police officer was missing, and that personalized the situation a little bit." Mark Kreider's first stop was the DeWild home. The detective arrived at the address, rang the doorbell. Dan DeWild himself appeared on the doorstep. He wouldn't let the detective into the house. Without DeWild's cooperation, Kreider had no right to inspect the house, which meant that important evidence could be missed. The detective asked what the reason for the refusal was, and why DeWild was unwilling to help the investigation if things were as he said they were. Dan replied that he had a personal attorney and would only answer questions in his presence. At that moment, David, Dan's twin, drove up to the house. Dan immediately called out to his brother, telling him not to engage in conversation with the detective. As Kreider watched, he realized that Heather's father was right. Daniel DeWild was hiding something. Why did he hire a lawyer if Heather just got tired of the family and left? He's not at all worried about the woman or looking for her, even though he swore his love for her a few days ago. Everything seemed as strange as possible, but the detective couldn't do anything without a warrant, and he had to leave. By the time police obtained a search warrant for DeWild's home, Heather had been missing for 6 days. Inside the home, Kreider said, the task force found no evidence of a crime weapon, nor was there any indication that Heather had been in the house. But investigators soon learned that on the day the young woman disappeared, David drove his Chevrolet car to an auto repair shop about 15 miles from the house. Why would David drive that far when the twins worked for the transportation department as mechanics and could have handled the car repairs themselves? Kreider got a warrant to look at the Chevrolet. Detectives speculated that perhaps Heather was dead and David had managed to hide her body away from home. To conduct an inspection of the car, they brought in specially trained dogs that reacted to the odor of a decomposing body. While checking David's car, the dogs began barking near the driver's side rear side door, indicating that Heather's body may have been in the car for some time. Detective Kreider met and spoke with David and described the search dog's reactions. At one point, the detective, looking directly into David's eyes, asked, "Did you kill Heather?" The man lowered his head and you could see how nervous he was. The man said he needed to talk to his lawyer and left. After talking to David, the detective had no doubt that both twin brothers were involved in Heather's disappearance. A day after receiving news that the dog smelled decomposition, David and Roseanne married, solidifying the police's suspicions. Roseanne later revealed that it happened so suddenly, just in case, because spouses are not required to testify against each other. Then, on August 4th, 2003, 2 weeks after Heather's disappearance, police found a white Nissan Sentra belonging to the missing Heather in the parking lot of an apartment complex in Wheat Ridge, Colorado, about 5 miles from Dam's home. According to locals, the car had been parked there for several days, with the passenger side window completely open. Detectives spent all day scrutinizing the car. It appeared so clean that there was no evidence that even Heather had ever ridden in it. We found no evidence of Heather's DNA inside or outside the car. We also found no fingerprints or anything else that would indicate that Heather had used the vehicle, the expert explained to Detective Kreider. Apparently, the perpetrator or perpetrators were careful and wiped out all traces qualitatively. Investigators searched the wooded area south of the apartment complex where the car was found. They used trackers, thermal imaging cameras, and a police helicopter. The search, to their dismay, yielded no clues that could lead to Heather. It was at that moment that Carol and Dave realized they had lost their daughter forever. Exactly 1 month later, on September 4th, 2003, Heather's body was discovered by a road worker shoveling dirt on the road to the canyon. He noticed a large trash bag in the ground, and when he got closer, he called the police. In the meantime, the body had decomposed so badly that dental records had to be used for identification. The woman's face was covered with a mask made of duct tape, and rope was wrapped around her neck and wrists. The body was wrapped in garbage bags and secured with duct tape before being placed in a shallow grave. Family members identified the clothing as the one Heather left in to meet Daniel on July 24th. The medical examiner was unable to determine Heather's exact cause of death, but the nature of her injuries suggested that she was strangled or died of asphyxiation. Investigators realized that the twins were involved. The location where the body was found was in the same neighborhood as the workshop that David visited the day Heather disappeared. The trash bags in which the body was wrapped matched the general class characteristics of the bags taken from the DeWild home. But it was circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence was lacking, and Kreider couldn't apprehend even one of the brothers, let alone both of them. Dave Springer felt crushed by the impossibility of doing anything. Heather was buried. Her parents placed a note in their daughter's casket with the phrase, "All she wanted was to love and be loved." There was a languid wait. No one told Heather's parents and sisters about the details of the investigation. It even began to seem to them that no one was dealing with the case at all. In fact, the investigation understood who was guilty, but the lack of evidence tied the hands of detectives. After 2 years, in 2005, in Denver changed the district attorney, who promised the Springer family to help in the investigation of the case. The formed investigation team once again thoroughly reviewed 1,500 pages of documentation and re-examined all the evidence and details of the case. However, these efforts yielded no new results. There was no physical evidence. DNA analysis did not reveal any links between the brothers and Heather's death. Detectives believed that in addition to the brothers to the case could be involved, and David's wife, Roseanne, who also lived in the house. But as an official spouse, she had the right not to disclose information about her husband, and so another 4 years passed. Heather's family still did not find a place. The father of the deceased admitted that sometimes he screams at night. He was sickened by the fact that Dan was sleeping peacefully on the loose, while their entire family was facing daily injustice. In 2009, the Heather DeWild investigation was taken over by Russ Boot Wright. The new prosecutor took the task with the utmost seriousness. In 6 years, the volume of documentation grew from 1.5 to 30,000 pages. There were 15 additional boxes with important details. After a while, a DVD of home movies caught the attention of the new investigative team. It turned out that during their marriage, Dan and Heather had engaged in unusual practices. Dan played the dominant role and Heather willingly submitted. Dan liked to tie Heather up. When detectives examined the home videotape, they discovered an important coincidence. The way Dan was tying Heather up in this footage was very similar to the way the woman was tied up when her body was discovered. Detectives also identified Dan's profile on a dating site where he listed himself as a widower, even though Heather was reported missing at the time and her body had not yet been found. During the investigation, they were able to find a witness who had seen Dan, David, and Roseanne early one morning, near the spot where Heather's body was later found. In addition, thanks to new technology that has emerged in recent years, experts were able to reinvestigate phone conversations between David, Daniel, and Roseanne on the day of the crime. All three made 14 calls to each other, and detectives have now been able to find out the geographical location of each caller. David's cell phone was used right near where Heather's car was found, and from there he called his brother, and then Roseanne. Combining all of the information obtained, detectives brought the perpetrators to justice. With only circumstantial evidence, more than 8 years after the crime was committed, Dan, David, and Roseanne DeWild were arrested on December 14, 2011. Each was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. As prosecutors prepared for trial, investigators hoped to somehow provoke the DeWilds. They hypothesized that Roseanne might be the weak link and tried to turn her against the brothers. It didn't work. The woman continued to claim that neither she nor the twins were involved in the crime. Dan, David, and Roseanne spent 8 months behind bars awaiting trial. The first to break down was David. 9 years after the crime, the man confessed that Heather took the life of his twin brother Dan. Maybe it was the arrest, the billing records, or maybe he really loved Roseanne and wanted to get her out of harm's way by making a deal with the prosecutor. Or maybe he just analyzed everything and chose freedom after 12 years rather than waiting a lifetime for sentencing. Either way, David took the deal. If it wasn't for his testimony, the brothers probably would have gotten away with the crime. David gave all the gruesome details. According to the man, his brother Dan began planning the crime back in April 2003, after he was ordered to pay child support. He carefully thought out every move he made. When Dan told David about his plan and asked for help, he said that in case of refusal, he would still get rid of Heather, but only alone. David admitted that he was afraid for his brother. He thought that Dan couldn't do it alone. He would be caught and put in jail immediately, so David agreed to help. According to the plan, Heather and the children arrived at noon on July 24, 2003. When Dan went to meet them, David allegedly tried to stop his brother, but he didn't listen. While the children played in the house, Dan took Heather to the garage, promising to return the now almost ex-wife's joint videos, which were allegedly stored there. In the garage, Dan grabbed Heather by the shoulders and threw her to the floor. According to David, he could have prevented the crime but didn't, continuing to just stand there and watch in silence. His brother took a hammer from the shelf and struck Heather several blows to the head, rendering her unconscious. Immediately after that, Dan took a rope, tied his wife up the same way he had tied her up during their intimate games, but this time he made a noose around her neck as well, and then suspended her from the garage roof. Dan's plan was that he wanted to make it look like his wife's death was an accident during their role-playing sessions. Leaving Dan in the garage, David drove Heather's car back to the apartment complex parking lot and thoroughly wiped the car down inside and out. By the time David returned to the garage, his brother had already wrapped his wife's body in garbage bags and placed it in the back seat of David's car. David checked the woman's pulse and made sure she was dead. He then got behind the wheel of the Chevrolet and drove to the pre-planned location where he was going to bury the body. Heather might never have been found if it hadn't been for a transmission problem in the car that forced him to hide the body elsewhere on the way to the canyon. Because David had to stop by an auto repair shop to get his car fixed, the investigation got clues about the car's movements. When asked by the investigators how the brothers managed to get rid of all the evidence so professionally, David said that they regularly watched crime programs on TV, and they gave a lot of information on these issues. For example, they used double gloves to leave no traces. David DeWild had to take a polygraph to confirm the veracity of his testimony. After the test, prosecutors offered him a deal. David pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit second-degree murder and received 12 years instead of life in prison. In November 2012, Daniel's trial began at the Jefferson County Courthouse. David testified, blamed the crime entirely on his brother, rehabilitated his wife Roseanne through his testimony, apologized for all the pain he had caused to Heather's family, and received 12 years. Daniel pleaded not guilty and continued to insist he did not know where Heather went after she allegedly left the house. His defense claimed that Heather took his brother David's life. After all, by his own admission, he was the one who disposed of the car and the body. But the jury didn't believe that version. They found Daniel guilty of conspiracy to commit a first-degree felony, but couldn't decide if he actually did it. Because of this, the judge set a new trial date. Just a month later, fearing he would end up in prison with no chance of parole, Dan accepted a plea deal, pleaded guilty to a second-degree felony, and waived his right to appeal. He was sentenced to 74 years in prison, which he continues to serve in Colorado State Prison. He will become eligible for parole in May 2045. His mandatory release year is 2084, when he will be over 100 years old. Daniel DeWild will likely not live to see that date. After the trial, prosecutor Raz Boot Wright said at a press conference, "Looking at the dynamics of what happened, it's pretty clear that Daniel set David up. He was in control of the situation. As for Mary Roseanne DeWild, we ultimately concluded that her knowledge of the events was less than previously thought. The case against her is dismissed as there is no reasonable likelihood of her conviction at trial. Roseanne continues to maintain that she didn't suspect anything and is waiting for David to be released." After Dan's arrest, Hannah and Jacob were taken into foster care by their own grandparents, Heather's parents. Dave Springer, Heather's father, has finally begun to sleep well at night. At the western end of Algoa Bay, stretching along the southeastern coast of South Africa, 400 miles from Cape Town, is the city of Port Elizabeth. In addition to being a major seaport, it is also the 6th most populous city in South Africa. It is in this city in November 2004, 18-year-old Chris Panayiotou graduated from high school and joined the trading corporation of his father, who owned a fairly large network of stores and eateries in the city and its surroundings. Chris had a desire to be involved in his father's business from a young age and developed an interest in the specifics of managing retail chains and how to develop the retail services industry. He possessed amazing energy and determination. His dreams extended far beyond being an executive and skillful employee under his father's supervision. He dreamed of owning his own fish restaurant, somewhere near a 5-star hotel along Marina Drive and a large supermarket right by downtown Kings Beach. That afternoon, he was helping his father at a small diner on Market Street. The establishment's 1-story-old building lacked square footage and glamour, but it was nonetheless popular with the neighborhood's youth. Here, Chris Panayiotou met his high school friend who invited him to a Friday night party organized by mutual friends at Barty's Tavern, located on the beach, and a constant success among young people. On Friday, sitting in a wicker bamboo chair and sipping beer from the establishment's specialty mug, Chris noticed a pretty young girl sitting alone at the bar, drinking lemonade from a tall glass. The young man left his seat and walked over to meet her. Her name was J.D. Dinks, and she had just turned 18 years old as well. A spark immediately ran between them. The young people found many common interests very quickly. After that party, Chris and J.D. began dating, not even realizing that their Friday night meeting at Barney's Tavern would be the prelude to a horrible love triangle story that would lead to a tragic death. J.D. was a girl with a cheerful and sweet personality. Her endless thirst for giving joy and warmth to others inspired her to devote herself to teaching. In 2005, she enrolled in university. While JD focused on her studies, Chris started his own business with tenacity and entrepreneurial spirit. The first business was a local grocery store, then a neighborhood restaurant and a cocktail bar, which Chris named Infinite. Despite the young people's busyness, the feelings that bonded JD and Chris grew stronger. It was a period when their relationship was growing stronger, like the roots of a young tree penetrating deeper into the soil. Both JD and Chris created their own little corner of happiness, where kindness and love seemed eternal, and days were filled with smiles and hope for an endlessly joyful future. However, over time, the lovers began to have problems in their relationship, or rather, one female problem. At first, Chanel Kutis was an employee of the store. She maintained with her employer, Chris Panayiotou, only business relations. But everything changed after a year. Among the office corridors and long store windows, secret love between Chris and his employee, Chanel Kutis, blossomed imperceptibly, and this woman became not just an employee of the store, but also Chris's lover. All, of course, carefully concealed. But employees, working next to this couple, could not help but notice the delicate hints of their affection for each other. Glances, enigmatic smiles, and gentle gestures left behind an aura of mystery and some hint. The lovers met secretly at night in local cozy hotels, and when JD was away, Chris even brought Chanel to his home. By this time, in the eyes of family and friends, JD and Chris looked like an established young couple. They were very well suited for each other and seemed successful and promising. JD had graduated from university and got a job at an elementary school on Nelson Mandela Bay, and Chris's business was doing well. Finally, they were officially engaged and began living together. Nevertheless, Chris's connection with Chanel continued. Chris's father, Costa Panayiotou, was terribly upset on the one hand and furious on the other with the unexpected news of his son's secret affair with a sales clerk. He could not understand how Chris, dating the intelligent, kind, and decent JD for 8 years, on the eve of the wedding, could behave so immorally. Costa found his son at Infinite celebrating his engagement with friends. That's where the heated conversation took place. Costa promised to disinherit Chris if he continued to date Chanel. Chris vowed to his father that he would leave Chanel, but in fact, continued his affair with Kutis. All this time, JD had no idea about her fiancé's affairs on the side. Therefore, Chris and JD were safely married in 2012. Soon, JD received an invitation to work at Rebecca College. Chris, spending serious money to support 2 women, gave his business its first blow. His finances dropped significantly. Expensive gifts to his mistress, spending on fancy hotel rooms, and treats all did not add to the profitability of the business. Over the next 3 years, Chris became increasingly estranged from his wife, continuing his affair on the side, thus destroying his business and family. JD felt that there was loneliness in her life and that Chris had her on the back burner, with no time to pay attention to her. The young woman shared with her friends a heavy sense of disappointment in her relationship with her husband. All her efforts to restore the former harmony did not lead to anything. Realizing the futility of her actions, by September 2014, JD realized that she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. On September 21st, she decided to address herself by writing a letter in which she shared her deep feelings. In the letter, JD clearly expresses her desire to be loved and have a normal marriage. She emotionally expressed her feelings and experiences of wanting to be loved by her husband and her desire for close, warm relationships and support. She longed for a normal man who would take care of her and with whom she could build a healthy relationship. JD expressed in her frank letter her frustration and dissatisfaction with her husband's behavior of hiding things from her. This caused her to feel a sense of distrust and uncertainty. She described her state as if her heart had been taken from her and it had been torn and trampled. JD also expressed a desire to spend more time around her husband. In the early spring morning of April 20th, 2015, a Monday, a rented car with 3 stout guys inside stopped near the gate of Staring Gled Village where the young Panayiotou couple lived. Their attention was drawn to a fashionably dressed young woman who was impatiently waiting for someone standing by the roadside. Two of the trio had already started to open the car doors to get out of the car when the driver, who was left behind the wheel, gave them a command to stay in their seats. They watched through the tinted glass of their car as a black BMW parked beside her. She settled into the back seat and the car sped past them, picking up speed. The driver annoyingly slapped his hands on the steering wheel. The next morning, Tuesday at 6:15, J.D. Panayotou left the house as usual to go to work at the college. It was no more than a 40-minute drive to her place of work, and she was waiting for her friend and co-worker Cheryl in her BMW to go there. She glanced absent-mindedly at the curb where she spotted yesterday's car with tinted windows. Cheryl was running late. J.D. pulled her cell phone out of her purse with the intention of calling her friend. In her sideways vision, she saw two figures coming toward her from the roadside bushes. Cheryl was only 10 minutes late, but J.D. wasn't at her usual spot. Cheryl had called her phone in vain, and calls to the door of the house were also fruitless. The college also confirmed J.D.'s absence from work. Anxiety rose in Cheryl's heart, and she called the police. By 10 o'clock in the morning, J.D. Panayotou was announced missing to the media and social media. On the same day, the search for the missing young woman began. In addition to the police and a special canine unit, volunteers from the local community took part in the search. Night fell, but unfortunately there were still no results. In the morning, the search resumed. A reward was announced for any information about J.D., then the amount increased. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a canine officer with his dog named Angel discovered the body of J.D. Panayotou in a bushy ravine near Quano-Bushley. She was fully clothed. The medical examiner found 2 gunshot wounds in her back and 1 shot to the head. Her bank cards and jewelry were gone, as if someone had tried to obfuscate the motives for the murder. It wasn't just an act of violence, it was a low, inhumane act. Who would take the life of such a kind and harmless person? JD's family was in shock. Family and friends couldn't believe this could have happened. JD's students and co-workers were also grieving. The heartache of the terrible tragedy spread like waves in the ocean, far and wide across the country. Social media buzzed with grief and bewilderment. Who could have committed such a despicable and senseless murder? On October 22nd, JD's family held a memorial service at the Catholic Church, and a funeral was held, attended by an unimaginable number of Port Elizabeth residents. So tragic and ridiculous was the young woman's death that it struck the citizens of the city and echoed with pain and compassion in their hearts. Among the family and friends of the deceased were also JD's students and colleagues who came to pay their respects and mourn the young teacher. But apart from people who knew J.D. Panayotou closely, the city cemetery was attended by operatives of the South African Police Service, whose attention was drawn to the strange behavior of the deceased's husband, Chris. The young businessman's grief looked rather fake. But most of all, the investigative team was surprised by the obviously staged farewell speech of the widower. Having checked its text through search engines on the internet, the police found an incredible similarity of Chris's epitaph with the dedication of Charles Atkins to his late wife. Of course, it was not a direct evidence, but the police officers had a suspicion about Chris Panayotou's involvement in the tragic death of his wife. They decided to keep a close eye on him. In addition, several other suspicious facts pointed to Chris's participation in the murder of his wife. On the eve of the funeral, on the tip-off of special agents, the police arrested on suspicion of possible participation in this atrocious crime one Latonda Seon, who turned out to be a security guard at Chris Panayotou's nightclub. The man gave statements indicating that Chris had approached him to hire killers for his wife, and that he, Latonda Seon, had found him 3 of his friends. Police also learned that on the day of JD's murder, someone tried to use her bank cards twice. After examining bank surveillance tapes, detectives found images of 2 men who Latonda Seon identified as his hired killers. Latonda actively cooperated with law enforcement, and they decided to release him from custody on the condition that he complete the task of gathering evidence and Chris's confession to his wife's murder. For this, the authorities promised to commute Latonda Seon's sentence. Following instructions from the police, Latonda called Chris and summoned him for a confidential conversation, which was recorded with special equipment. In it, Panayotou revealed himself fully, which allowed the investigation to arrest Chris at night, 2 hours after the telephone conversation with Litonda. Soon, based on the detailed testimony of the detainee, 3 more suspects were arrested. After that, the picture of the crime was completely reconstructed by days, hours, and minutes. Chris ordered the hitmen to kill his wife, J.D. Panayotou, on the morning of April 20th, 2015, when she would be waiting at 6:30 a.m. for her co-worker Cheryl in a car that would take her to work. However, on this day, the perpetrators had a setback. Cheryl arrived to pick up J.D. in her car a little early to save her friend's life on that spring April morning. The killers were forced to reschedule the execution of the order for the next day, which proved more fortunate for them. On April 21st, J.D. appeared outside the gates of her community at 6:15 a.m., and the 3 criminals were already there, 2 of them in an ambush, not far from where J.D. usually waited for her colleague. Now the killers changed their plan. They did not kill J.D. near the housing estate, but decided to kidnap her, take her to another place, and execute their vile plans there. J.D. had no time to actively resist, so swift and unexpected was the attack. The 2 men grabbed J.D. firmly from both sides under her arms, depriving her of maneuverability, and threw her roughly into the back seat of a speeding car. The young woman was so shocked that she didn't even scream or resist. The 2 kidnappers were sitting on either side of her, and there was no way to get out of the speeding car. J.D. tried to offer the criminals money, but they had other things on their minds. After 30 minutes of fast driving, the car pulled off the dirt road into the woods northwest of the village. They led the young woman to a small ravine, and each fired a revolver once. The men then took the valuables and jewelry in cold blood and threw the body into a small ravine, hastily covering it with brushwood. The criminals then drove to a nearby ATM and withdrew $100 using the murdered woman's bank card. On the same day, they tried to withdraw cash again, but due to an incorrectly entered PIN code, the payment was not executed. Both withdrawal attempts were recorded by surveillance cameras. On October 11, 2015, the trial against Chris and the 2 mercenaries began and generated unprecedented interest throughout the country. The case was covered in all media with detailed details. The prosecution argued that the motive for the murder was financial debt and difficulties in supporting 2 women, Chris's wife and mistress. The trial revealed the key points of the case. Chanel Kutis, Chris's mistress, took the witness stand to testify about the lavish gifts Chris gave her. Her testimony also confirmed that she slept over with Chris when his wife J.D. was away and described their passionate nights at various hotels in the city. Various pieces of evidence were presented in court, such as records of calls between the hired killers and the bouncer of the Litonda Sion nightclub, ATM videos, and pictures confirming withdrawals, GPS coordinates of the location of the hidden car, and other evidence that pointed to the defendant's involvement in the murder. The court discussed the financial situation of Chris, who appeared to be having difficulty supporting both women. This created a motive to get rid of one of them. The mysterious death of the 3rd defendant just before the trial began added to the mystery of the case. He may have been an important witness for the prosecution, or may have had information that could have been even more damaging to Chris and his co-defendants. The court concluded that there was sufficient evidence to support the involvement of Chris and the mercenaries in the murder. Their motivation was related to the financial problems and life difficulties of Chris, who decided that getting rid of one of the women would be the solution to his problems. J.D.'s story is a true tragedy. Her life was too short and full of injustice. All the witnesses called by the court described J.D. as a kind and devoted woman. Her death was a loss to all who knew and loved her. The court clearly concluded that Chris killed his wife out of greed to avoid financial problems. This motive makes his act even more inhumane and cruel. Chris's actions show how some people can go to extreme lengths for their own gain. Chris, as well as the 2 hired killers, received a life sentence. This is a just punishment for such a horrible crime. Liton Sioni had yet to be fully sentenced because he went to cooperate with law enforcement. However, there are still some mysterious and unexpected 6 moments in this tragic story. The tragic death of Chris's father, Costa Panayotou, on December 9, 2019, added more mystery and grief for the already existing tragedy. Chris's affair with a store worker and Costa Panayoto's unwillingness to accept this choice of his son could have been a source of family conflict and tension. It is not yet clear who killed Costa Panayotou and why. This horrific crime leaves many unanswered questions and adds an element of mystery to an already complicated situation. The situation of Chris Panayotou, who put his own interests and desires above the life and well-being of his wife and family, is one of intense outrage and condemnation. If his actions were related to the death of his father, it would add even more complexity to an already horrible situation. If Chris Panayotou had anything to do with his father's death, he should be punished for yet another crime. Either way, this horrible man now will never go free. On December 20th, 2017, a press conference was held during which Mark Perez, special agent in charge of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, announced a breakthrough in the disappearance of Mike Williams, a Tallahassee real estate appraiser who was originally presumed to have drowned while duck hunting on Lake Seminole on December 16, 2000, and was eaten by alligators. "Being here now, I can tell you what happened to Mike Williams," Perez said. "Mike Williams did not drown in the lake. He wasn't eaten by alligators. He didn't leave town and leave his wife and 18-month-old daughter behind. He was murdered. In the interest of the investigation, we cannot yet release details, but I am happy to report that this morning investigators notified the Williams family of recent discoveries in the case." Today's story is not only about love, betrayal, infidelity, and greed, but also about a mother's resilience. For 17 years and 4 days, Cheryl Williams, Mike's mom, disagreed that her son had drowned in Lake Seminole and pushed with tenacity for law enforcement to investigate her son's disappearance. She believed with all her heart that those responsible would be punished, believed even when no one else did. "I had 2 choices. He was alive or dead. I chose to believe he was alive, and I really think that's what helped me," Cheryl said on December 20th, 2017. "A lot of people called me crazy, but if I had given up, we never would have found him." The day before the press conference, Brian Winchester, a close friend of Mike and his wife Denise, who later married Brian, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike's mother was right. Retribution came to those responsible, and ironically, they were the cause of the truth coming out. In 2000, Brian and Denise's affair, which began in 1997, turned into a murder. And years later, they went from lovers to strangers who didn't trust each other. Brian was very afraid that after the divorce, Denise would inform the police about what had happened to Mike, so he attacked her. Denise, on the other hand, went to great lengths to get him a life sentence. She was very persuasive in asking the jury for the maximum sentence, and it was these efforts that led to Brian having nothing to lose, and he made a deal with the prosecutor. Brian was sentenced to 20 years in 2017 for the kidnapping of Denise Williams, but he avoided a life sentence. Denise was celebrating the victory and was unaware that the conviction was part of a deal in which Brian Winchester, 49, admitted to planning the murder and a 17-year cover-up of the murder and received immunity from any prosecution for his role in the case. In exchange, he led investigators to Mike's body and gave a full and truthful confession. It would only be a few months later, and on May 8, 2018, Denise Williams would be arrested. At first glance, things are a little confusing, aren't they? Let's break down this case in detail. Jerry Michael Williams was born on October 16, 1969, in Bradfordville, north of Tallahassee, the son of a bus driver and a kindergarten teacher. Family and friends called him Mike. Even though the family didn't have much money, and the boy, along with his older brother, grew up living in a trailer, those were happy times. The parents cared about their son's future, and instead of building a house, they set aside money for the education of both boys, who themselves worked part-time at night in supermarkets. The sons enrolled in North Florida Christian High School. There, Mike excelled. He became student council president, played soccer, and was active in the Key Club. At the age of 15, Mike started duck hunting as a hobby and met Denise Merrill. The young lad was a soccer player and student council president. Denise was a cheerleader and council secretary, and they began dating. Friends thought they were a great couple. While still in high school, Mike became best friends with Brian Winchester, whom Denise introduced him to. Brian later had a friend, Katie Thomas, and the two couples remained friends for the rest of Mike's life. After high school, Mike attended Florida State University, where he majored in political science and urban planning. The lovers graduated together. Denise became a public accountant. Mike became a real estate appraiser. Mike proved to be a valuable worker. He often worked 15 hours a day, and of course his career took off. In 1994, the young, successful man married Denise. It was around this time that Brian married Kathy as well. All four of them continued to stay in close contact. Mike loved his wife dearly, strived to provide for their family as best he could, and had incredible energy. At the age of 31, Mike Williams achieved considerable success. As a real estate appraiser, he was earning nearly $200,000 a year. The couple was able to afford a home in a small, upscale neighborhood on the east side of town, and in 1999 became happy parents. They had a daughter, whom the couple named Ansley. Mike's friends told me that he was always prudent. Since the young man was engaged in quite risky activities, he wanted to be sure that in case of disaster, his family would definitely be taken care of. Not surprisingly, Mike turned to his best friend, who was working as an insurance agent at the time. Ryan sold him 2 insurance policies for $250,000 and later for $500,000. In 2000, Mike's father passed away. Williams was so stunned by this suddenness that, wanting to financially secure his own family, he again turned to a friend. Brian helped Mike to insure his life for $1 million. Thus, about 6 months before his disappearance, the life of the loving father of the family was insured for almost $2 million. According to Denise, on the morning of December 16, 2000, her husband woke up early to go duck hunting on Lake Seminole, a large reservoir connected to the Apalachicola River. It was the day of their 6th wedding anniversary, and the couple planned to celebrate the date at night in Apalachicola, a small town on the bayou. The wife and daughter waited for Mike at home at noon, but he never returned. Naturally, Denise became concerned and called her father, who in turn called Mike's best friend, Brian Winchester. Together with his father, Brian drove to Lake Seminole. There they found Mike's Ford Bronco car near the boat dock. But Mike himself was nowhere to be found. The men went around to all the places Mike liked to hunt, but couldn't even find the boat. So they decided to call the police. After investigators from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency were called, the search for Mike began. A few hours later, the helicopter pilot found the boat drifting about 225 feet from the boat ramp. The search of the boat turned up Mike's shotgun, still in its case. Apparently, he never got to use it. The search became a rescue operation. Locals believed that before the 3 rivers were dammed to form the lake, the reservoir was the site of an orchard. Thus, the lake got its name Stump Field, due to the many remaining stumps that protruded above and below the water level, requiring careful handling of any motorized boat in the area. Because of this, searchers speculated that Williams hit a stump on his boat, fell out, and submerged himself in the water. His wading boots filled with water, and he probably drowned when he couldn't get out. Several other agencies were called in to help, including a dive team from Montgomery, Alabama, and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. But the extensive and methodical search yielded nothing. Mike was never located. A week passed and the rescue operation turned into a body search operation. Teams were given probe holes to probe the bottom of the lake, and dogs were brought to the site. 10 days into the search, volunteers found a camouflage-patterned hunting hat that could not be linked to Williams. Officials with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency speculated that Mike had been eaten by alligators, which is why the body could not be found. There were actually quite a few alligators living in the lake. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement found no signs indicating a violent death and agreed with that theory. After 5 weeks, the search was called off. The day after the search was called off, Denise held a memorial service for Mike, less than 2 months after the alleged accident. It seemed to everyone that Denise had come to terms with the loss of her husband, but Mike's mother had not. 6 months later, in June 2001, an angler discovered wading boots floating in the lake. Divers searched the lake area and retrieved a lightweight hunting jacket and flashlight from the bottom. In one of the jacket's pockets was a hunting license with Williams's name and signature. The find raised many questions. Neither the hunting jacket nor the boots had visible teeth marks indicative of an alligator attack. None of the items found showed signs of having been in the water for 6 months. The boots were not slimy and the flashlight still worked. However, a week later, Denise's attorney asked the court to declare Mike Williams dead. Based on the items found, he suggested that alligators and other aquatic life had swallowed the body whole. The motion was granted. The death certificate said Mike died on December 16, 2000. Cause of death: accidental drowning while duck hunting on Lake Seminole. The body has yet to be recovered. This is how Mike Williams' story might have ended if not for Cheryl Williams, who refused to give up and continued to search for her son. "All I know is that I can't stop looking for him until I find him," she said. Cheryl's efforts seriously strained her relationship with her former sister-in-law. Denise demanded she stop searching and accept reality. She said, "I'm tired of seeing articles about Mike and his disappearance. I just want to move on with my life. If you keep pushing this investigation, you will never see your granddaughter again." Cheryl couldn't give up on her son, and Denise carried out her threat. If not for the mother's persistence, her son's story might have remained submerged at the bottom of a dark, algae-covered lake. It took Cheryl Williams 3 years to convince law enforcement officials to open an investigation into her young son's disappearance. "I made phone calls, put up signs about my missing son, wrote to the governor of Florida every day, compiled my notes into an evidence book, asked people to post on social media, and contacted reporters," Cheryl will tell you years later. The persistent mother contacted Matthew Oresco, an alligator expert. In his response, he explained that alligators do not feed during the cold winter months. Cold weather causes water temperatures to drop, so alligators don't feed in the winter. All they do is maintain their body temperature. 14 degrees is too cold for an alligator to be interested in food at all. Moreover, Oresco wrote that after an alligator kill, there is always forensic evidence left behind. Eventually, after 3 years, Cheryl Williams convinced law enforcement to drop the ridiculous alligator theory and launch an official investigation into her son's disappearance. The case was reopened because of little-known facts regarding alligators' eating habits. Evidence gathered from interviews and a little official data convinced investigators that Williams' death was no accident. "My gut feeling is that Mike did not die in Lake Seminole, and that's the general consensus of all the law enforcement agencies working on this case," said Ronnie Austin, a former investigator with the 2nd District State's Attorney's Office who prosecuted Mike's case. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency initially took over the case because Williams was considered a missing hunter. Officers spent 735 hours searching a 10-acre section of the lake for the body, but didn't spend a minute looking for signs of wrongdoing. Jackson County Sheriff's deputies brought in to help with the search also did not consider other possibilities. Investigators interviewed everyone involved in the search, and police officer David Arnett, who was present at the scene that day, years later said, "Some things immediately looked strange. Williams didn't usually hunt alone. His truck was found in an undeveloped area from which he would have had to drag the boat over mud, not on the nearby concrete boat launch he usually used. The terrible storm that night should have pushed the boat to the east shore, but it was found on the west shore. The boat's motor wasn't running, but it was full of gasoline. If Mike had been driving the boat and fell out of it, it would have continued to float in circles until it ran out of gas." Unfortunately, law enforcement began to doubt too late that they were dealing with a simple drowning. The crime scene had already been trampled by numerous volunteers and searchers. A car that could have served as a clue was taken by the family without any verification. Potential witnesses were missed. Denise Williams and Brian Winchester became suspicious to investigators because they learned that Winchester had divorced his wife Kathy and married Denise. They also learned of Denise's unexpected financial gain of nearly $2 million from her late husband's life insurance policy. Detectives determined that it was Winchester who sold the policy to Mike. They also found it strange that Denise, as Mike's wife, did not want to have anything to do with the investigation and tried to prevent Cheryl's activity, even forbidding the grandmother to communicate with her granddaughter. In 2005, the newly married couple were called in for questioning, which gave nothing new to the investigation. Brian provided an alibi for the morning of the disappearance of Mike Williams. He said he was 60 miles from the lake, at home, in bed, as his ex-wife Kathy could attest. He said he had intended to go hunting with his father-in-law in the morning, but overslept. Denise's interrogation also yielded no new leads. In 2008, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement announced that Mike's disappearance was not an accident, and they believe he was the victim of a crime. However, without sufficient evidence, they alas cannot prosecute. We have suspicions, but we need proof. Another investigation failed to find out her son's fate, but Cheryl Williams did not give up again. Her efforts led to the Discovery Cable Channel doing a story on Mike's disappearance and subsequent investigations in late 2011. By then, Cheryl had become disillusioned with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, believing it was either incompetent or uninterested in solving the case. Beginning in 2012, Mike's mother wrote about one letter a day to the governor, Rick Scott, asking him to either assign the investigation to another agency or appoint a special prosecutor to do so. Cheryl sent 2,600 letters to the governor over 9 years. In 2012, Denise caught Brian cheating and they broke up. The following year, Denise filed for divorce. After a few more years, an appraisal of the former family home was to take place, after which even property issues would no longer bind them. This event was a turning point in Mike's case. Brian didn't want a divorce. Denise didn't want to continue the relationship. They were constantly fighting, and the Williams investigation was poking fun at them. Brian would call Denise and she stopped returning his calls. He couldn't handle the stress level. On August 5, 2016, the day a real estate appraisal was due as part of a court order, Denise left her home to drive to work at Florida State University. While talking to her sister on the phone, she saw someone climb over the back seat of her car. It turned out to be Winchester. Brian pressed a loaded gun against Denise's ribs and told her to drive straight ahead. He said he had to do that because she wasn't answering his calls. Denise tried to calm Brian down, agreed with everything he said, and promised to give him a chance to save their marriage. Brian believed it. Denise assured him that she wouldn't go to the police and report what he had just done, and Brian got out of the car. As he got out, he took the brown sheet, plastic sheeting, bleach sprayer, and tools with him. It became clear that Denise had miraculously escaped death. Denise called emergency services. Brian was quickly arrested and charged with kidnapping, which is a first-degree felony in Florida and carries a life sentence as the maximum penalty. He was also charged with domestic violence and armed burglary. The court decided to keep Brian in custody without bail. Cheryl Williams expressed hope that this development will lead to the solving of her son's disappearance case. "Brian is not going to let Denise run around alone with all that money," she told the New York Daily News. "I pray that he will tell us what really happened." And Brian did tell, bargaining himself an extremely favorable deal with the prosecutor and avoiding a life sentence. "At first, I think we were all doing really well, but I wasn't a good husband," Brian began his story. "One day, I found a note in my first wife Kathy's purse and realized she was cheating on me. I wanted revenge. We often went to bars and concerts with Denise and Mike. I had been friends with Denise since high school. I was never really attracted to her. But after Kathy cheated on me, I started looking at other women differently." The affair between Brian and Denise began in October 1997. One-time drunken sex at a rock concert quickly escalated to frequent secret meetings. We started meeting at hotels during the workday. We met whenever we had the opportunity. Brian recounted. He did not want a divorce. Denise made it clear that she would never divorce her husband. Public opinion was important to her, and she did not want to share custody of her daughter. Over time, the affair became more than just meeting for casual sex. Denise and Brian thought of themselves as a couple, exchanging gifts and love letters. It became clear that they couldn't go on like this. They could not be without each other, and divorce was unacceptable to Denise. Her pious image was not to be harmed. Around this time, Mike almost died in a hunting accident. Brian saved him, and Denise suddenly saw a way out of the situation. After the deal with the prosecutor, Brian will reveal, "The year 2000 prompted us to start talking about Mike and Kathy's death. Denise wanted it all on me, not her, and she wanted a scenario where it wasn't a murder but an accident. She wanted death to be left up to God. That way she could live with it. After considering various options, Brian and Denise settled on a boating accident. In doing so, they timed the murder so that they could get the maximum possible payout on Mike's life insurance policy. They both realized that Mike had to be killed before one of the 3 policies expired at the end of December 2000. The plan was in place. Brian called his friend to go hunting. He said he'd found a great spot on the shores of Lake Seminole. Mike expected to go there with Brian and return home by noon to celebrate his anniversary with his wife. I told him that we were going to go to a special place and that he absolutely had to bring his wading boots with him. I had to make sure he took them with him because it was believed that if you fell overboard in wading boots, you would drown very quickly. The plan was to make death look like an accidental drowning. Once Brian and Mike were in the water, Brian pushed Mike out of the boat, but instead of sinking, he grabbed onto the stumps and began to wade through them to the shore. Brian panicked. I didn't know what to do. Mike started calling loudly for help. I didn't know how to get out of this situation. I had a shotgun. I was panicking and I shot him in the head. I didn't think about what I was doing. Things didn't go according to plan, and I needed to cover up what happened. There was hardly any time left. I should have been back home by now and getting ready to go hunting with my father-in-law. No one knew I was at the lake with Mike, so I decided it would be best for me to drive home and pretend like I had overslept. I drove home and hoped that Kathy was still asleep. I entered the house as quietly as I could. Katie was asleep. My phone was on the floor. I went to bed, called my father-in-law, and apologized. Brian did everything he could to create an alibi for himself. Then he hid the body. Denise didn't know that Brian had shot Mike in the head and buried him. Brian tried to tell her, but she didn't want to listen. It was enough for her that her husband was gone. Denise wanted to go on living with the idea that it was God who kept him from swimming out and let him drown. According to Brian, they promised each other that neither of them would ever say anything. Denise and Brian justified what happened by saying that the main reason Mike was killed was because it was impossible for them to live together. We said the money was just the cherry on the cake, Brian would pronounce in court. Investigators learned that it was Brian who planted a hat, boots, flashlight, and license. First, he needed to keep searchers from leaving the lake, and afterwards he needed grounds to pronounce Mike dead so Denise could get insurance. Since a recognition process usually takes about 5 years, the lovers managed it in just 7 months. Including Social Security and other benefits, Denise received about $2 million. On May 8, 2018, Denise Williams was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory to a felony, which carried a life sentence. Denise pleaded not guilty to all 3 charges. In February 2019, she was sentenced to life in prison. 5 months later, Mike and Denise's daughter, Ansley, received all of her late father's assets and insurance money owed to Denise. In January 2020, Denise Williams appealed the conviction and life sentence. Her attorney argued before Florida's First District Court of Appeal that there was no evidence that she was involved in committing the murder. In November 2020, the murder conviction was overturned, but the 30-year sentence for conspiracy to commit murder was upheld. Denise is now in custody at the Florida Women's Reception Center. She will be 78 years old when she is released. Brian Winchester was transferred to Madison Correctional Institute in Florida to serve the remainder of his sentence. His current release date is set for July 30th, 2036. He will be 67 years old. Ansley, daughter of Mike and Denise, insists her mother is innocent and places the blame on Brian Winchester. She refused to speak to any media regarding the outcome of the case and her personal life. According to Cheryl and Nick, Ansley's uncle, they have not been able to connect with Ansley. Cheryl is very sorry that she has lost not only her son, but also her granddaughter. There are crimes that at first glance are difficult to assess unambiguously. On the one hand, the law of any state guarantees the inviolability of life and health of every person. In contrast, it is often opposed by the testimony of witnesses who minimize the guilt of the attacker. One such controversial case was the crime that occurred in the Mullenix family. Let's try to make sense of it together. Let's find out the reasons for the tension and weigh the responsibility of each person involved. Could it be that the victim is far from innocent? Or is her executioner a wolf in sheep's clothing? an unexpected discovery. On September 14, 2006, Newport Beach was troubled. A woman's body was discovered in a body of water. Apparently, the corpse had been wrapped in a sheet and then placed in a box. When exposed to the water, the unreliable wrapping fell apart and exposed what should have been hidden from view. The body floated to the surface after being in the water for no more than a day. Normally, warm water would speed up the decomposition process. Therefore, the appearance of the dead left much to be desired. Forensic medical examination established the cause of the woman's death was multiple stab wounds. In total, she received about 52 blows, one of which came directly to the eye. Specialists agreed that the injuries were caused by 3 different knives, which means there were at least 2 people who attacked the victim. Naturally, the victim had no identification on her, so the police had to work hard to find out her identity. Among the missing, the profile of the woman was not listed, and no new disappearances have been reported so far. Everything pointed to attempts to cover up the crime committed. Experts also determined that the woman had resorted to plastic surgery during her lifetime. She had breast augmentation. Since the identification of bodies by serial number of implants became a routine procedure, the identity of the murdered was soon established. She was 56-year-old Barbara Mullenix. Who is Barbara Mullenix? The future Mrs. Mullenix was born on May 29, 1950 in Munich, Germany. In her youth, she was very beautiful and sociable. Therefore, she was always in the center of attention. However, these qualities brought her not only success with the opposite sex, but also caused her a lot of trouble. At the age of 18, she was subjected to violence. The girl wanted to forget as quickly as possible what happened, but after a while she learned about the pregnancy. To make an abortion Barbara did not become, she decided to bear the child and give it to a good family. After a while, she got married. In the marriage, she gave birth to a son, Alex Hagwood. However, the marital relationship with her first husband did not last long. At the age of 35, Barbara's attention was attracted by Bruce Mullenix. The man recalled that she was a special woman and immediately liked him. She was characterized by straightforwardness and self-confidence. In November 1987, the couple married. Mr. Mullenix was younger than his wife for 9 years, but it was not particularly felt. Barbara knew how to arouse interest and liked to have fun. After moving to Oklahoma City, a daughter, Rachel, was born to the family. Everything was fine at first, but as time went on, problems began. In the evenings, Bruce could skip on a mug of beer and on weekends to drop in on friends. Barbara at first supported the company, but later became addicted to alcohol. Apparently, the events that occurred in her youth left their imprint. Under the influence of alcohol, the woman, despite the parents' relationship with each other, they loved their daughter very much. They spoiled her and tried to please her in every way. While living in Oklahoma, before the divorce, Rachel had a large room while her father and mother lived in a small one. On the occasion of the girls' birthday parties were always held in the house. Miss Mullenix recalled that she was very close to her mother, even more so than most mothers and daughters. But such a close bond existed only when the woman was sober. The rest of the time, Rachel tried to stay away from her, made no attempt to even talk to her. Our relationship was generally good, but when Barbara drank, she got angry and crazy. She was the first one to get into a fight. Bruce confirmed what his daughter said. Since the house Mullenixoff was located near Hollywood, Barbara was in an extraordinary delight. She loved movies, especially singled out Gone with the Wind. A short time after the move, the woman managed to get a job as an extra. Hollywood dream come true. She felt that in time she would be offered a more serious role. But for now, together with her daughter, took an active part in the masses in movies and TV shows. The scene of the crime was established. Who is the culprit? Police officers could not understand why none of the relatives did not report the disappearance of the murdered woman. Soon, police officers Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright obtained a search warrant for Barbara's home. They hypothesized that since the woman was wrapped in a sheet, the crime could have occurred in bed. So the search for evidence had to begin at Mrs. Mullenix's residence. The police found no one at Barbara's house. At first glance, everything seemed to be in order. There were no visible signs of a crime. However, in one of the rooms on the second floor, a disassembled bed attracted attention. It was without a mattress. It only took a couple hours to reconstruct the scene. The detectives' assumptions had a real basis. Specialists found traces of blood on the walls. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to get rid of the evidence. The blood-stained mattress had apparently been destroyed. There was no doubt that the crime had taken place in this place. The police also believed that the owner of the house knew the perpetrator. Therefore, the first suspect was Mr. Mullenix. It was a strange coincidence that the man was out of town. In addition, just the day after the body was discovered, Bruce returned home. He explained that he was worried because his wife and daughter were not answering their phone calls. The man, of course, had a premonition of something wrong, but in no way expected to hear such a thing. Nevertheless, the news of Barbara's terrible death, the former spouse took it calmly. This also alerted the detectives, so they began to investigate the reason for his departure. Bruce said he was on a business trip. Mr. Mullenix's management confirmed his alibi. The investigation was back to square one. Daughter's love. When Rachel turned 17 years old, she met with Ian Allen. The guy was older than the girl by 4 years. Young people fell madly in love with each other. Ian supported Rachel in everything, even helped with household chores. At first, Barbara liked him. They even spent time together. They went for walks together. They went out together. In order for the lovers to meet freely, Rachel's parents got a special permit. Apparently, so required by law and police officers. Law enforcers often drew attention to the non-standard couple. The girl was allowed to be absent until 1 o'clock in the morning, but she often violated the established schedule, for which she was repeatedly under house arrest. After a while, Mrs. Mullenix noticed that her daughter's feelings were growing into something more. To make matters worse, the two announced that they had decided to get engaged. The move seemed too quick to Barbara. Ian and Rachel had only known each other for 3 months. Barbara didn't want to lose her daughter and the payments she received from her ex-husband. Barbara decided to increase her influence and discipline. Rachel was caught between two fires. She didn't want to offend her mother, whose control was only increasing. Ian, in turn, did not give way. So her mother and Ian began to compete for Rachel's attention. Rachel's fragile psyche suffered with every quarrel and altercation that arose between them. By the end of the summer of 2006, Ian and Barbara's relationship finally deteriorated. The younger Alan was afraid that Rachel's mother would convince her not to date him or forbid her from doing so at all. One day, when Rachel once again violated her schedule for coming home, Barbara exploded. Despite the late hour, Mrs. Mullenix headed to the boyfriend's house and made a scandal. This situation really offended and angered Ian. It became clear to everyone that it couldn't go on like this. On the trail of the fugitives, Bruce was no longer suspected of killing his ex-wife. Detectives turned their attention to Rachel and Ian. Police found out that Barbara had been feeling lonely lately and was drinking a lot. It made her inadequate. Her daughter's attention was slipping away from her. She considered Ian an unworthy companion and Rachel a traitor. That's why Mrs. Mullenix often quarreled with them. Besides, no one knew where the lovers were. They never contacted each other. Given the complicated relationship between Barbara and Ian, the girl's father assumed that Ian was a criminal who was being sought. Rachel, in all likelihood, is not safe either. Otherwise, she would have made herself known, Mr. Mullenix pondered. The police began searching for the missing persons. The Allens' house was also searched. When the detectives checked Ian's computer, they found curious queries on the internet. The guy was researching the route of transportation to the city of Tampa, which is located in Florida. Bruce remembered that before moving in with him, Barbara and Rachel lived there. The couple was reported missing. All police stations in the country received bulletins with a description of the appearance of young people. In addition, the alleged suspect did not disappear without a trace. He left a decent trail behind him. Ian Allen's credit card was used to make a purchase at a gas station in Louisiana, That's also where a surveillance camera captured the guy's truck. Mr. Mullenix's fears were confirmed. Rachel was indeed with him. The only thing left to do was to intercept them. So officers Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright called their colleagues from the next town on the couple's route. Local police shut down highways in search of the van. Ian Allen and Rachel Mullenix were soon caught. The kidnapping story. "Do you know I've been kidnapped?" Rachel shouted when apprehended. "What right did you have to arrest me, to throw me on the ground in handcuffs?" She continued, "I'm not a criminal for you to treat me like this." Detectives Joe and Steve waited for the moment when they could finally question the couple. 2 days later, they arrived at a Louisiana police station. Miss Mullenix insisted that she had not killed her mother. Once investigators pressed the girl, she blamed it on her boyfriend. Rachel claimed that Ian killed her mom and afterwards forced her to run away with him. The police asked for more details about what happened on September 13th, 2006. "I woke up to hear noises in the house. Then I realized that my mother was screaming a lot and calling for help. I rushed to her room. What I saw shocked me. Ian had attacked my mom with a knife. He was stabbing her over and over again. I jumped on him, tried to push him away. He was very strong, so he easily fought me back. I couldn't believe what was happening. I was in a kind of stupor." Rachel began her story. Afterwards, she added that the boyfriend forced her to help cover her tracks. He also insisted that she pack her mother's belongings into bags. Rachel claimed that by doing so, Ian wanted to stage Barbara's unexpected departure. At first, the detectives wanted to believe the girl. The shock she'd been through could send anyone into a state of frustration. But for some reason, the witness to the crime was overly justified. And afterwards, she fiercely insisted that she was not involved in the crime. Furthermore, there were no signs of resistance on Rachel's body. When communicating with Ian Allen, police officers found out an interesting fact. His girlfriend from time to time told about how hard it is for her to live with her mother, how intemperate the woman behaves when she drinks. Instead of reconciling the rivals, Rachel only increased Ian's negative feelings. Certainly some of the facts were true, but some of them were clearly exaggerated. That was why Ian was finally convinced that Barbara would not let them rest. Sometime after the night's quarrel at the Allen house, holding a grudge against Barbara, the lad headed for the Mullenix house. Rachel was under house arrest. I wanted to see her. I knew Barbara wouldn't let me in to see her, so I came secretly. I wanted to sneak into her room quietly, but Barbara spotted me. We got into an argument that escalated into threats. With the folding knife I always carry, I decided to scare her. As soon as the blade was at Mrs. Mullenix's throat, she started screaming. This made me angry and provoked an attack. Things got out of control. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Rachel really had nothing to do with it, Ian said about the incident. To the surprise of the investigators, the guy did not try to avoid responsibility and confess to everything. Over time, detectives became increasingly convinced that Rachel Mullenix was directly involved in the crime. Her boyfriend was clearly covering for her. CCTV footage from the gas station convenience store where the couple had stopped was scrutinized. Rachel was walking around the store looking for groceries. At that point, she could have safely called for help or run away. But for some reason, she didn't. Moreover, as it turned out later, the girl had the opportunity to call her father, but preferred to make a call to her friend. It was found that a couple of hours after the crime, Miss Mullenix sent a message to Ian Allen. "I love you," she wrote in her text. And that's how Rachel finally lost the trust of the investigation. Rachel's defense. It took 2 years to gather and analyze all the evidence in the Barbara Mullenix murder case. During that time, Rachel turned 19 years old. For any other girl, that's a great age. There is a whole life ahead of her. For young Mullenix, her future depended on the jury's verdict, and she tried to convince everyone of her innocence. When Rachel talked about her childhood, her face lit up. It was obvious that the tender years were happily spent. No doubt Barbara and Bruce had tried to make them so, despite many circumstances. Recalling the relationship with her mother, the daughter said that they were good. They were marred only by alcohol, which was abused by the murdered woman and the boyfriend who appeared over time. At school, I was known as a girl from a not very prosperous family with alcoholic parents. When my father drank, he was still himself. He was kind and considerate, which can't be said for my mom. She described the family atmosphere in court. Her words were confirmed by her friend Kelsey Douglas, who often visited the Mullenix family. Kelsey said that Rachel always tried to please her mother in everything, but apparently there came a point when she could no longer tolerate the harsh control and insults. She admitted to me that she had started drinking from time to time. Rachel didn't know what else to do. She had nowhere else to turn. The alcohol helped relieve tension, to forget for a while about family difficulties, Miss Douglas reported. Alex, Rachel's older brother, strangely enough, also stood up for Rachel. He considered her a victim rather than a murderer. That's why he refused to believe in her guilt to the last. He told the court that his sister had been a good and obedient child. She did well at school, practiced sports and ballet. As for the relationship between Barbara, Rachel, and Ian, Alex noted that at first they were great. All three spent a lot of time together. Barbara's eldest son also reported that their mother abused alcohol and illegal substances before her death. She took stimulants and tranquilizers and often threw loud parties. When Barbara realized that Rachel and her boyfriend wanted to distance themselves, she couldn't accept it. In addition, she found it difficult to get by on her own without alimony and maintenance money. All of this became a source of irritation. According to Alex, Mrs. Mullenix was a very controlling woman. She wanted to be in control of everything. With Rachel, she certainly went overboard in this. My mother loved to be the center of attention. With Ian coming into Rachel's life, her position shifted to the side, Alex summarized. In the involvement of his daughter in the murder of Barbara could not believe and the girl's father. He believed that she loved her mother very much and was incapable of hurting her. In all the time, Rachel did not accuse her mother of the weaknesses that were peculiar to her. She simply reported them as a fact. The girl repeatedly stated that she felt sorry for her. Barbara had a difficult life. About the relationship of her parents, Miss Mullenix recalled with bitterness. Rachel said that the slightest details in the behavior of his father drove his mother into a rage. Barbara often snapped at him, considered a spender. Rachel also told the court that she regretted her love for the young man. She made a big mistake when she started dating him. Their feelings brought discord to her relationship with her mother. Ian felt that my mom was a threat to him. He also wanted to control me like she did. My boyfriend wasn't ideal either. Often hurt and treated me like I was his property. I was torn between the two. Every time there was an argument with my mom, I shared about it. It made it easier for me to get over what happened, Rachel recalled. She concluded by adding that Ian did everything he could to prevent harm to what he thought was his prosecution's position. Sonia Belest, the prosecutor involved in the case, did not believe Rachel's story. She claimed that the girl's angelic appearance was deceptive because she thought she was already smart enough for her age. Therefore, the position Miss Mullenix had chosen was thoroughly refuted. The officers who investigated supported the prosecutor in this. Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright believed that Rachel had some mental health issues. According to them, she was the meanest girl they had ever spoken to. During the interview, the prosecutor competently appealed the inconsistencies in Miss Mullenix's testimony. She inquired of Rachel why she never once called for help when she could have done so, to which the girl replied that she was confused and did not know how to behave in such a situation. The defendant also added that she was frightened by Ian's behavior, which was difficult to predict. The prosecutor drew attention to the fact that Rachel had not a single chance to escape. The girl's actions were atypical for a kidnapped victim. The prosecution believed that Miss Mullenix had not only attacked her mother herself, but had planned the crime in advance. When they tried to ask Rachel about the details of Ian's stabbing, Rachel was unable to answer. Her testimony changed and contradicted each other more than once. During the trial, the defendant stated that she was not present during the argument between Barbara and Ian. Allegedly, she simply left them in her room, hoping they would calm down. Only then did she hear screaming and the sounds of a struggle, after which she came running back and saw that the guy attacked her mom with a knife. However, Rachel's version did not coincide with the evidence that was found at the scene of the crime. The forensic report clearly established that Barbara's attacker was not alone. Specialists estimated that 5 minutes had been enough to kill the woman. Rachel continued to insist on her own innocence. Questions: why she didn't call emergency services, why she wrote a love text to the killer boyfriend, were frozen in the air unanswered. The forensic psychiatrist who worked with Miss Mullenix diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder. He believed she truly loved her mother, but she hated her equally as much. By the way, people with this kind of personality are prone to erratic behavior. It's often destructive to both the unsub and others. Bitter verdict. It took the jury 3 days to reach a final verdict. Ian Allen was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. For Rachel Mullenix, the court's verdict was no consolation either. She was found to be involved in the death of her mother and qualified the act as first-degree murder. The girl was sentenced to life in prison. Her first chance for parole will come when the inmate turns about 41 years old. After the verdict was announced, the prosecutor said she was relieved. There is no question that Ian Allen and Rachel Mullenix killed Barbara, Sonia Balest concluded. For a mother, such a death was a true betrayal. The day Barbara brought her daughter into the world, she signed her own death warrant. The child she loved immensely became her light and darkness at the same time. Undoubtedly, Mrs. Mullenix made many mistakes in her life. She was not an ideal mother, but she never abandoned her children to perdition. Barbara's jealousy and fear of being alone hardened the woman's already strong character. But people in love always have a choice. They could simply leave to preserve their right to their feelings. In time, things would have calmed down, relationships would have mended. Perhaps Barbara would have switched to something else, and the grandchildren Rachel and Ian would give her would be her outlet. The tragic story of the Rose family is considered one of the most bizarre and confusing crimes committed in America in recent years. This case struck investigators not only by its cynicism and cruelty, but also by the fact that the victims and the alleged perpetrators were close relatives. Despite the fact that many years have passed since the crime was committed, and the perpetrator has long served his harsh sentence behind bars, there are still many questions and white spots in this story. Many still do not believe in the fairness of the court's verdict. Now let's get down to business. It was an ordinary, average family living in a provincial suburb of Bristol in the state of Tennessee and had never been on the radar of law enforcers before. The family was headed by elderly couple Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, who had lived together for over 40 years. They had 2 grown daughters and 6 grandchildren, but we will only look at those family members who were directly involved in this high-profile case. So, at the time of the crime, in the house and the surrounding area were the elderly owners themselves, Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, their eldest daughter, 39-year-old Tosha Milhorn with her husband James, and 6 children. 2 of the children were Tosha and James's shared children, while the other 3 children were their heirs from a previous relationship. Also present in the house was a neighborhood girl who stopped by to play with them. It is worth noting that Tosha and James and their children lived at Tosha's parents' house for about 2 months, as their own home was undergoing renovations at the time. Later, another key player in those events, 19-year-old Seth Denton, arrived at the house. He was Toshi's eldest son, but his relationship with his mother and stepfather was strained, to put it mildly, and they avoided communicating with each other in every possible way, and their last meeting ended in tragedy. According to neighbors, the Rose couple was quite happy and prosperous. Their daughter Tosha was also happily married to James, who worked as an auto mechanic and was fond of restoring vintage cars. It was the Rose couple's family home that was the scene of the carnage. Police officers who arrived on the call later dubbed it the worst crime scene they had ever seen and the bloodiest in the history of their quiet county. The bodies of 2 women, Lena Maria and Tosha, a mother and daughter, were found in the house, shot almost point blank. Tosha was in a chair at the dining room table, and her mother was lying on the floor between the table and the refrigerator. Also lying on the doorstep of the house was the critically wounded James, Tosha's husband, who was quickly rushed to the hospital. But despite the efforts of the doctors, the man soon died of extensive internal injuries and massive blood loss. None of the children in the house were injured. It is likely that they were not targeted by the shooter, or were simply not in his field of vision at the time of the massacre of the adults. Almost immediately after the crime, the police received 2 phone calls, one after the other. The first call came from the owner of the house, Curtis Rose, who said that his eldest grandson Seth had committed a shooting in the house and then fled the scene. But soon there was a call from Seth himself, who told a different version of what happened and blamed everything on his grandfather Curtis. In addition, it turned out that Seth was wounded in the arm and shot him, Curtis. However, he did not deny it, saying that he was trying to detain his grandson and not let him escape from the scene of the massacre. The alleged killer, Seth Denton, was arrested in the hospital, where he sought medical help in connection with the wound. Then the investigation was to restore the chain of tragic events and find out what really happened in the house of the Rose family. Surprisingly, but for the basis of the investigation was taken only one version, and the second version was taken seriously only a few years later. On August 29, 2015, around 6 o'clock in the evening, residents of houses located near the scene of the crime heard a series of gunshots. No one paid much attention to it, as there were forests around where hunting of wild animals and birds was allowed. Later, one of the neighbors noted that he was a little alarmed by the number of shots and then the silence, but he did not consider it a good reason to call the police. Another neighbor testified at trial that in addition to the gunshots, he heard screaming and went out on the porch of his house to see what was going on. At that point, he saw a young man running down the path from the neighbor's house to a car parked by the road. He was being chased by another man, but because of the trees by the road, the witness had a poor view of what was happening. He only saw the guy jump into the vehicle, then 2 shots rang out, and then the car sped off. Just a few minutes later, neighbors heard the howling of sirens and saw police cars and emergency vehicles starting to arrive at Rose's house, and soon an air ambulance helicopter landed on the lawn outside the house, arriving to pick up James, who was still alive. Everything that was happening resembled the shooting of some movie, and none of the eyewitnesses did not understand what happened. Arriving police officers were met by the elderly owner of the house, who was holding a firearm, and another gun belonging to him was later found in his bedroom. Curtis told his version of events, which was taken as the basis of the investigation and was long believed to be the only one. According to Curtis, there was nothing to portend trouble that day. In his and his wife's house visited his daughter with his son-in-law and grandchildren, as well as a neighbor's child who came to play. He himself was tinkering in his trailer in the backyard of the house. He heard the sounds of gunshots, but like most neighbors, he didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it was hunters in the woods. Suddenly, his oldest grandson, Seth, appeared at the trailer, arriving unannounced and looking very excited. The young man said there had been some kind of tragedy and asked him to call emergency services immediately. Curtis followed his grandson into the house, where he immediately came across the dead bodies of his wife and daughter. Curtis immediately thought of the children in the house. They were in the other room, frightened, but none of them were hurt. He took them to the back of the house and locked them up so they wouldn't see the horror that was going on in the house. While Curtis was calling emergency services, he saw his grandson hurriedly leaving the house and running toward the road. The homeowner drew his gun and began to chase Seth, believing that he was the killer. As Seth jumped into the car, Grandpa fired 2 shots. One bullet shattered the rear window without hitting the driver, and the second bullet hit Seth in the left shoulder. Despite the injury, he managed to get away, but after reaching the nearest house, Seth stopped to call the police and report what had happened. The local sheriff who was investigating was puzzled. The picture of the crime looked so strange and illogical that similar cases simply did not exist in his memory. In a breaking news report, he said that the investigators had a difficult job ahead of them to reconstruct the whole picture of the crime. After the arrest of Seth Denton, it was necessary to establish the motive why the young man had treated his family members so cruelly, and most surprisingly, such a motive was quickly found. Seth was the eldest child of his mother Toshi, whom she had given birth to in her early youth. Her relationship with the boy's father did not work out, and her son's upbringing was mostly handled by his grandparents, while the young woman settled her personal life. Also, according to some reports, Tosha suffered from bipolar affective disorder and periodically went to the clinic. Most likely, her son could also inherit this disease. Since childhood, the boy had a strong resentment towards his mother, whom he hardly ever saw. With age, this feeling turned into hatred, about which Seth often told friends and relatives. After graduating from school, the guy decided to go to serve in the army, and a year later, returning home, he again settled at his grandparents'. However, soon the young man decided that he wanted to start an independent life and moved to the city, where he rented a small apartment with his friend. He got a job at one of the local fast food restaurants, but shortly before the tragedy, the guy was fired. Family and friends spoke positively about Seth, noting that he never had any violent tendencies, did not run with bad companies, and never broke the law. But despite the positive characteristics, detectives considered that the main motive of the crime was Seth's unpleasant feelings towards his mother and her current spouse. According to the investigation, the events of that day developed as follows. Around 5 p.m., Seth drove his car to the house of his grandparents. He was wearing a camouflage jacket, and in the car lay a semi-automatic rifle. He left the car by the roadside, and with the weapon in hand, he went to the house, entering through the back door. Seth then fired several shots, killing his mother, grandmother, and severely wounding his stepfather, before leaving the jacket and rifle by the back door and going to his grandfather's house and asking him to call the police. The order in which the shots were fired was never determined because Seth completely denied his guilt. In addition, it was unclear why he asked his grandfather to call the police rather than fleeing immediately from the scene of the crime. It is assumed that his main target were his mother and stepfather, and the guy killed his grandmother as an unnecessary witness. As the main evidence proving Seth's guilt, the case included his jacket and rifle, found on the threshold at the back door of the house, traces of blood on his shoes, as well as bullets found in his car. Remarkably, about 100 rounds of ammunition in total were found, but no one questioned why he needed so many if he only planned to kill 2 people. Another oddity was the timing. According to the grandfather, after he and his grandson entered the house, where the terrible picture opened before his eyes, Seth hurriedly left the scene. Curtis himself found and took the children to safety, called the police, pulled out the gun he kept, and after all this, managed to catch up with his grandson and shot him twice. It was not until 2016 that the young man presented his version of what happened in court, which no one had previously considered for some reason. According to Seth, he has always been very close to his grandparents who raised him, but meetings with his mother he avoided by all means. As a teenager, he often went to shooting ranges with his grandfather, and it was his grandfather who encouraged him to join the army. On that fateful day, Seth called his maternal aunt Amanda, his mother's younger sister, and said he was going to visit his grandparents but didn't want to meet his mother there. The woman did not know that Tosha and her husband were visiting her parents, so she assured Seth that he could go without fear of crossing paths with his mother and stepfather. Amanda confirmed that information in court, noting that her nephew couldn't have known that Tosha and James were at Rose's house. Seth had hoped that he and his grandfather would go to the shooting range, and that was the reason he had brought a rifle with so many rounds of ammunition. He drove up to the house, got the gun, and went straight to the trailer where Grandpa usually worked. There, his grandson showed him his rifle, and they had a little discussion about it. Curtis then headed for the house without letting go of the rifle, and his grandson followed him. Seth knew that his grandfather had a gun and expected him to follow him, and afterward they would shoot targets together. However, when Curtis entered the room, he immediately opened fire, and the people in the room did not even have time to realize anything and did not try to run away or hide. According to Seth's lawyers, Curtis may have had a temporary insanity, during which he killed members of his family. But this version seemed untenable, so it was not considered initially and marked in court. Although on the clothes and shoes of an elderly man also had traces of blood of the victims, he, for some reason from the very beginning, was not even included in the number of suspects. The young man in the dock was facing the capital punishment of death for the premeditated triple murder of his family members. His grandfather had been a key witness in the case from the beginning, and despite the fact that he had openly stated that he was prepared to kill his grandson that day, the court found such behavior justified. Curtis Rose was not taken to the station or questioned as a suspect, and his version of the events of that day was accepted as the only true one. In addition, many details and inconsistencies were simply overlooked, and Seth's version was not even considered until a year and a half after the crime. Most of the physical evidence did confirm Curtis's words, but what was out of the picture was somehow ignored by the investigation. The main argument in court was that Mr. Rose had no obvious motive for killing his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. The version of temporary insanity seemed far-fetched and untenable. The trial lasted more than a week, during which time nearly 200 pieces of evidence were presented and dozens of witnesses, including neighbors, relatives, and family friends, were heard. The grandfather and grandson's testimony completely contradicted each other, and it was obvious that one of them was lying. The jury deliberated for several days. They admitted to being severely exhausted emotionally and physically, but when it came to a verdict, they unanimously stated that they had no doubt that the defendant was guilty of each of the counts charged. Thus, Seth Denton was found guilty of triple murder, but after a detailed review of all the evidence and circumstances of the tragedy, the court decided to exclude the death penalty from the possible punishments, changing the sentence to life imprisonment without the right to parole, at least the next 50 years. The convict himself never admitted his guilt. He is currently serving his sentence in a Tennessee prison. As for the orphaned children of Tosha and James Milhorn, they were left in the care of other family members, including their Aunt Amanda and grandfather Curtis.